What's this red button do?
A restricted area. You may experience a phenomenon known as true necessity. Let's rock.
Hello, welcome back to The Record Process. Today, we are going to pick up where we left off with the second part of our series, talking about capturing sounds and where those sounds fall in the overall concept of the song. There's a lot to get into, so I want to kind of dive right in. Tom, Adam, are we caffeinated enough? Are we ready to roll?
We're heavily caffeinated. We've got good food in our belly, and I think it's time that we get this.
Mediocre food.
Oh well,
yeah.
That's for another podcast, but also a fair assessment. Mostly because I know that there is so much that myself and both of y'all have up your sleeves to get into and really put forward. So I don't want to waste any more time. And let's talk about the first kind of conceptual thought that we need to break into when you set forth after you have your session set up and all the good stuff that we talked about in the first part of the series. Then the first thing you're going to want to start thinking about, whether you're the producer or the engineer, or if you're the artist working in a home studio capacity, whatever side of that glass you're on, you're going to have to communicate what the artist's vision is and what they're looking for and what they hear in their head, right? So that's kind of the first part of this, and you want to kind of dissect what you're going for and what you're shooting for overall. And sometimes this is informed by, if you have a really flushed out demo that you've done, we talked about that and the importance that's kind of setting things up for success in terms of, having a guide or a representation of the song and maybe the basic instrumentation, or maybe it's really detailed, Tom. I mean, we work with, a lot of people that are very skilled in their own DAWs and from programming standpoint. Adam, I know you do as well, really talented musicians, a lot of whom probably have a really dialed in vision from a demo standpoint, maybe with some tracks that they might even want to use in post, in the final session. But, if they don't, I think there's a couple good questions that should be asked up front to make sure you know what they're going for and what the song that they are trying to capture is ultimately best served as in terms of a tracking approach. So what are some questions, Tom, let's start with you. What are some questions that you try to maybe bring out of an artist to get on the same page, right? Or maybe for your own vision? Yeah,
I feel like one of the first questions that you may have for an artist, for honestly just anyone that you're working with, whether it be artist, producer, anyone like that, some references of what they like. What do they like to listen to? What do they imagine this project to be? What do they imagine the sounds to be? Is it this big, gigantic, icy guitar sound, or is it this very mellow, hot, steamy drum sound? There's
Oh, I'm here for an icy guitar sound.
And maybe it's both. Maybe it's both those
Fire
elements.
Nice, baby.
Yeah. And understanding what they want and why they want it, and how that pertains to the song and your interpretation of the song, because that's important for how you mic it up, how you choose the instruments, how you do all that. And that would be my first go, is just to ask references, ask to hear what they're hearing in their head, what the track, what the song means to them, what the EP album means to them, that kind of stuff. Yeah, Adam?
Well, yeah, and Tom, I think you're getting into like some really good things, and I just kind of had this thought now where it's like, obviously the most important part when it comes to making a record is communication between all parties, right?
Yeah.
And the way that I see it, there are like 3 different types of communication that you can go through. And as a songwriter, I've used all 3 of these throughout my evolution as an artist and a songwriter. And you know, getting to work with you guys, I've learned a lot about this. And Tom, it sounds like what you're touching on is like one of the first ways, like the most basic way to like get across ideas is through emotional quality, where you want to talk about the feeling, how it's supposed to sound. You're going to use a lot of qualitative words, like you're going to use descriptors like icy. You're going to use sad, distant, you know, or up in your face, aggressive. You know, You're going to use all of these words that like don't necessarily translate to something immediately on a dial somewhere, but like as an engineer or as a producer, it's your job to be able to translate that emotional, quality into something that's actually, sonically relevant for the record.
Yeah.
And then another really great way right after that to get across your ideas is to go into like referential communication, talking about references, being like, man, I really want my guitar to sound like it does on Rolling Stones' Let It Bleed. Awesome. Let's set it up. Because we know what that means as engineers and as producers. We know, okay, that's like an Ampeg just like dimed out, or something of that ilk. Just like real good like rock and roll sound, or like if there's a vocal thing, that's when it's our job as producers and engineers to go into our history banks and our knowledge banks and pull out all that stuff. And then kind of like the third evolution of that would be to get right into the technical talk, which I've found to be incredibly useful as a songwriter and producer. And I think it's made my communication with Tom and Casey and anyone that I've worked with a lot easier, where now instead of just talking about the emotional quality or referencing something that I already know what it sounds like, I'm able to reference pieces of gear, exact settings, like being able to communicate through like the knobs basically with my engineer or my producer at that point, makes it really easy for me to be able to get the sound that in my head as an artist and a songwriter is going to get reproduced, because I know exactly how to do it. And maybe that producer will have like a better idea of how to do it. But being able to like speak those technical terms, if you're like evolving beyond just the emotional and the referential stuff, is huge. And I'm sure, Casey, you've had experiences within your band because you have a lot of very talented, not only instrumentalists, but you have talented like technical people in your band, where I'm sure a lot of that is happening for you guys too now, where like people are describing more settings and more specific pieces of equipment rather than just being like, I want it to sound like rock or whatever,
Yeah, we had, we kind of have the full spectrum from the, the real technical, like, well, if we wanted to achieve this, maybe, Nick or I or myself, Matt will like talk about like a very like, something that sounds kind of like hyper, like pumpy and like really over compressed or whatever, you know what I mean? Or like just like scooped like this, like, and then like just through a Pultec dimed up, or just like nuking something with with a distressor. Like we understand, on that end of the spectrum. But then there's also, our singer Dan is such a creative force in his own right and comes to the table, very often with a full vision, but isn't necessarily translating it in, like I can hear my vocals going through this through these 3 pieces of outboard gear and then treated like this in post. He's thinking it of almost a more emotional quality, where he's just like thinking about it like a huge, massive thing, and then this really intimate upfront thing, and being able to bring that, to us as a band, so we can write and figure that out and what that means sonically from an instrumentation standpoint and arrangement standpoint. But then also having those conversations when we step into the studio, that should be known right off the bat how you're picturing certain parts, because that'll inform how an engineer is going to set it up, right? I mean, this happens a lot. We mentioned a few episodes ago, talking about how drums inform the style a lot of times of a production. That's a conversation that a lot of times drums are one of the first things to be tracked. They're the foundation of a lot of rock music, and even if it's not rock music, it's very rare. I'd venture to say that you're going to have someone either like in hip hop, rap, like a lot of like very vocal production centric stuff that goes in and tracks that stuff without some sort of programming or music bed, that's composed of the rhythmic content. So knowing that, it goes a long way to be like, well, great. Then I guess if we're going for like a really close mic'd, very dry sounding setup, then I guess I won't spend an extra half an hour throwing up a really elaborate room miking setup, right? It's like, or I won't waste, if I'm trying to capture a whole thing, sometimes as engineers, Tom, this so well, and you've mentioned this so many times over the years, where you're charged with making decisions, right? And sometimes you don't have an infinite amount of tracks, and I think especially you living in the box and people that are living in, it's so easy to just hit Control-Shift-N, new track, right? New track, duplicate track. Every time you want a new idea. But when you're in the studio, like capturing, that's not always the case. And especially with drum recording, it's like you don't have, rarely are you going to find yourself in a scenario where it's just like, nor would I recommend this approach for a number of reasons that we'll kind of get into a little bit later on. And even when it comes down to the mixing phase, you can actually make more problems for yourself by not making these decisions early on. And so that's going to, having that conversation be like, I'm hearing really huge, like boomy, roomy toms. And like, I want this. It's like, okay, cool. Well, then maybe we should do that. Or it's like, hey, I want this real, like, Anderson .Paak kind of like real quiet, really like a lot of finesse and all this stuff. It's like, okay, cool. Maybe that's more suited to doing like a crotch mic approach and like a really, really, sensitive, mono content, what I mean, in the right spot, and really taking time to find a way to capture the kit with one mic specifically, as opposed to, a way more modern process thing where you're going to be replacing or supplementing stuff with samples, right? So it's, it's using your time as best you can by having those conversations with the artists up front about and giving them references like, hey, we love the drum sound on this record. That's how we want our drums to sound. Or we love the way the vocal is processed on this record, and be like, oh, okay, cool. Then I won't be afraid of kind of squeezing it on the way in because I know that's what we're going for. So I can get more out of my analog chain on the way in as opposed to trying to play it safe, right?
And I think, like, on that point, too, like, being able to communicate in both directions, especially as somebody in the driver's seat needing to make decisions, like talking from a producer standpoint or an engineer standpoint, being able to, like, talk through all three of those components as a professional, I think is really important, because it's one thing to, like, know your tech and know, like, what sounds good. But, like, especially if you have, like, a particular artist who's, like, no, man, I really want this sound off of this record. Like, it has to be like this. But you as the engineer or producer know that may not be the thing that actually serves the song. I think being able to communicate those ideas back to the artist in the technical way, in the referential way, and in the emotional way, where, like, I've definitely been in sessions with Tom where he's been like, hey, we should do it like this. And I'm like, I don't know if we should do it like that. But then when Tom pleads his case from, like, an emotional standpoint of how it affects the music and how it affects the artistry, I'm now more inclined as the artist to give him that power to be like, okay, you're not just doing this because it's easier or because the gear isn't there or whatever it might be. You're doing it for, like, an emotional reason. So I think being able to communicate in both directions is super important to, like, not only get what the artist wants, but to ultimately serve what the song needs.
Right.
Yeah, and I think I was just listening to something the other day where the artist went at this entire process where they went through the emotional, the referential, and then the technical, and then they were so tied up with the technical that it kind of got them lost. So I think it's like there's almost four types of communication where you go from emotional to referential to technical, all the way back to a new type of emotional where it doesn't matter what technical aspects are in it as long as it comes out to be what it feels like. If that does that